Have you ever noticed how strangely our memory of the past is constructed? We are shown formal portraits. We are told about the gallant age, the Enlightenment, palace refinement, high society beauty. But if you linger on these faces just a little longer, the picture begins to crack. The canvases show almost no real hair. Instead, powder, curls, heavy constructions, as if an entire era decided to hide its own head under a foreign covering. We are told it was fashion, that it's all explained by lice, dirt, hygiene, and convenience. But the closer you look, the weaker that explanation sounds. Because what we see is not a random whim of the rich. It is not an isolated caprice of the French court. It is a phenomenon that seemed to simultaneously seize the entire upper stratum of society, from London to St. Petersburg, from Paris to Vienna. And here, the most uncomfortable question begins. What if the wig was not for beauty? What if it was for concealment? What if the glittering elite of that time was hiding not a fashionable choice, but traces of something far more troubling? Write where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Today, we will piece this story together. Portraits, powder, white lead, clothing, rules of propriety, architectural oddities, the logic of the court. And the further we go, the harder it becomes to see the wig as just an accessory. Because sometimes the most harmless detail turns out to be the key to an entire era. And possibly an era that feared not poverty, not war, not scandal, but its own reflection. Let's start with what lies right on the surface, but is almost never seriously discussed. Look at the portraits of the 18th and 19th centuries. Kings, ministers, court ladies, generals, judges, bankers, advisors, nobles. These are all people who were supposed to embody strength, order, taste, and self-assurance. Yet a huge portion of them have on their heads not hair, but carefully constructed decor. Powdered wigs, intricate hairpieces, artificial curls, whitish ringlets, as if a natural appearance had suddenly become unacceptable. The strangeness here is not that someone once invented a fashionable accessory. The strangeness is in the scale. This is not one court, not one king, not one capital. It is an entire visual code of the era. And this code repeats with frightening persistence. Different countries, different dynasties, different political traditions. But the picture is the same. People who were supposed to represent the pinnacle of human type, for some reason, collectively rejected their own natural appearance. In ordinary logic, fashion arises as a game of status. Someone wants to look richer, younger, brighter, more refined. But here, a strange feeling emerges. The wig does not adorn a person in the usual sense. It does not make them look alive. It makes them standardized. As if the goal was not beauty, but to make all heads equally acceptable in public space. Equally correct, equally safe. That is why this video's first question sounds so harsh. What exactly was hidden under this construction? Because if an entire class suddenly puts an artificial covering on its head, it is no longer just aesthetics. It is mass behavior. And mass behavior almost never arises from nothing. Behind it lies fear, advantage, or necessity, sometimes all at once. And the longer you look at these faces, the harder it is to shake the feeling that the wig was not an adornment of appearance, but a replacement for something lost. Not a luxury, not a court jest, not a minor whim of the age, but something like a public patch for a problem that could not be acknowledged aloud. And if so, then we must start with the most protected explanation, the official version about fashion and hygiene. For decades, we have been told the same convenient formula. People of the past suffered from poor sanitation. Lice were common. Washing was rare. So they shaved their heads and wore wigs over them.
It sounds simple, even too simple. And that is precisely the problem.
Because as soon as you break this version down step by step, it stops looking convincing. Suppose the goal really was hygiene. Then why not a short haircut? Why not a shaved head with nothing extra? Why not simple cloth protection that could be washed? Why not practical solutions for people who had money, servants, access to the best craftsmen, and a desire to maintain status? Instead, we see heavy, expensive, finicky wigs that required upkeep, were soaked in grease, dusted with powder, absorbed odors, and were clearly not models of cleanliness. So the official version asks us to believe this: an elite capable of building palaces, organizing the most complex court rituals, and governing states, chose the most inconvenient way to solve an allegedly mundane problem. Not the cleanest, not the cheapest, not the most logical. Precisely the one that created more hassle, more expense, and more dependence on specialized maintenance. Does that look like a solution dictated solely by practicality? There is another thing. If it were simply fashion, it would not look so obligatory. Fashion can be played with, softened, broken, made one's own. But with wigs in high society, it looked different. They became part of the norm. Lacking the proper head meant falling out of the proper circle. This is no longer a free choice. It is social discipline. And social discipline always hides a deeper fear. So the issue might not have been that living with hair was inconvenient. The issue might have been that appearing without hair was impossible. And here the wig ceases to be a charming quirk of the era. It begins to look like a mask without which a person could not appear in society without revealing something dangerous about themselves. When something from the realm of fashion suddenly becomes almost obligatory, it is always an alarming signal. Because true fashion loves variety. It allows playing with images. It tolerates exceptions. It thrives on contrasts. But the wig in the 18th century aristocratic world increasingly behaved not as an ornament, but as an element of acceptable appearance. As if a person without this construction already looked incomplete, already seemed not to be who they should be. And here an important psychological logic opens up. For a society to cling so tightly to artificial hair, the absence of natural hair must have been perceived not neutrally, but painfully, as a sign of weakness, as a mark of decline, as something that undermined the very picture of power. Imagine a court where every gesture is subject to ritual, where everything works to convey an impression of strength, wealth, and the highest quality of life. And suddenly, part of the elite begins to lose what is associated with the image of life's fullness: hair, beard, skin freshness, bodily persuasiveness. This is no longer a trifle. It is a blow to the myth. In such a system, a wig ceases to be a mere whim. It becomes a prosthesis for one's reputation. It restores to a person not beauty, but the right to be seen without humiliation. It creates the necessary silhouette. It corrects what could not be corrected otherwise. And that is precisely why an entire culture of service, rules, propriety, and habits grows up around it. Because when your natural appearance is taken from you, you begin to depend on the artificial. Consider this as well. A wig does not merely conceal the absence of hair, it also equalizes everyone within the caste. It makes heads look alike. It removes individuality. It transforms a living appearance into a sign of membership in a club. This is no longer just concealment. This is discipline through appearance. Everyone must look as if all is well, even when all is far from well. And from this grows a next, much darker thought.
What if the problem wasn't with just a few people? What if the need to conceal one's true appearance was so widespread that it turned into a collective conspiracy of propriety? Then we are no longer talking about a strange fashion. Then we approach the version of a widespread physical affliction, one it was not customary to speak of openly. If we look at a wig not as an ornament, but as a reaction, the picture changes immediately. Then we see not a caprice or a game of status, but an attempt by an entire stratum of society to adapt to a common problem. And the hypothesis here suggests itself. What if the elite truly faced mass hair loss? Not isolated cases, not an age-related feature, but a phenomenon that became so noticeable it had to be turned into the norm. This version sounds stark, but it has a frightening internal logic. It explains precisely why wigs spread so widely and so synchronously. Why the rejection of a natural appearance acquired an almost obligatory character. Why society did not choose simple solutions, but built an entire industry around the head. Because if a problem is mass, it cannot be silenced. It must be rewritten into the language of status. One must make a mark of affliction look like a mark of refinement. And then much falls into place. A wig is needed not because it looks beautiful. A wig is needed because without it, one cannot maintain the legend of a healthy, strong, prosperous upper echelon. Moreover, if the phenomenon spanned different countries, it forces one to ponder the cause. Why did it coincide? Why do the same external solutions simultaneously become the standard in different parts of Europe? Why were the upper strata of society so tightly bound by the same visual code of concealment? At this point, the story begins to extend beyond a single hairstyle. Because hair is too noticeable, too symbolic an element of the body. Its disappearance cannot be completely hidden. It can only be masked. And mass masking always signifies a collective fear of exposure. Not even before commoners, but before themselves, before the mirror, before the court, before the political reality where weakness cannot be shown. But if the disappearance of hair was only the first layer, then others must have followed. And it is here that we move to what looks no less strange in that era than wigs. To faces thickly coated with white lead. To powder that seemingly everyone needed. To skin that was as if forbidden to be alive and natural. The white face became almost as obligatory a sign of the era as the powdered wig. We are again told this was about aesthetics, that paleness was considered noble. It showed a person did not work under the sun, was not engaged in rough physical labor, belonged to the highest circle. But here too, too much does not add up. Because one thing is a slight pallor as a sign of status, and quite another is a dense, heavy, almost chalky layer behind which the face loses its vitality and begins to resemble a mask. If this is simply a canon of beauty, why does it so insistently demand concealing the real skin? Why does the era not admire natural features, but strive to cover them up? Why place over a living face something that makes it even, dry, impersonal?
And why use compounds whose harm was too obvious even by the standards of the time? Lead, mercury, aggressive mixtures. All of this does not resemble a harmless desire to appear more elegant. It looks like the price of concealment. Here arises a particularly unpleasant thought. What if beneath this decorative layer they were hiding not just imperfections, but the consequences of internal affliction? Spots, irritation, unevenness, traces of a morbid lifestyle. Possibly the consequences of the toxic environment in which the elite lived. And then white lead becomes not cosmetics, but a second skin. Not an ornament, but a barrier between a person and the gaze of others. Notice how remarkably these elements combine. First, living hair disappears and an artificial head appears. Then, living skin gives way to a white mask. A person is as if reassembled from decorative layers. Hair is substituted. The face is smoothed. Individuality is softened. Everything is subordinated to one task: not to show too much, not to betray weakness, not to let reality break through. And the more such details we put together, the less plausible the version of innocent luxury appears. Because luxury demonstrates excess. And here we increasingly see not excess, but defense. And if the defense was so dense around the head and face, then perhaps they had to conceal not only them. The next question is then obvious. What else in this era was covered up with fabric, powder, gestures, and rules of good manners? Now look at the fashion of that time a little more broadly. High collars, jabots, neckcloths, gloves they were in no hurry to remove, fans behind which one could hide the mouth, heavy perfumes, elegant manners where distance and the correct angle are almost as important as clothing. All of this is customarily considered the language of refinement. But if we look at the era as a system of masking, the details begin to sound different. The neck is one of the most vulnerable zones. Hands betray health no worse than the face. The mouth and breath can shatter any image in seconds. And so we see a culture where almost every one of these zones is brought under control. The collar hides the neckline. The jabot blurs the silhouette. The glove removes skin and nails from view. The fan allows not only for coquetry, but also for covering the lower part of the face. And perfumes work not as luxury, but as a constant barrier between the body and others. To this also belongs the story of teeth. We know well examples of elite figures who lost their teeth relatively early and were forced to use dentures. This is usually explained by diet, poor dentistry, sugar, the general level of medicine. But in combination with other signs, this begins to look not like a coincidence, but like another link in the chain. An elite that in portraits must be a symbol of the fullness of life, in reality, increasingly needs substitution. Hair, substituted. Skin, covered. Smile, controlled. Odor, masked. Thus arises the image of the court as a space where beauty is no longer free, but regulated by illness and fear. The more luxurious the facade, the stronger the feeling that it is assembled against decay. Every accessory, every norm of behavior, every fold of fabric works not only for style, but also for concealment. And in this world, even elegance begins to seem not a triumph of life, but a well-paid defense against exposure. But the harshest part of this story lies ahead. Because if signs of trouble were indeed noticeable, we must understand why they concentrate precisely at the top. Why does the layer that should have been the best protected suffer first? At first glance, this defies common sense. If a health crisis begins in a society, the poor should suffer first. Those with worse food, worse housing, less care, fewer chances of salvation. But in the story of wigs, everything seems to unfold in reverse. It is the elite that sets the tone for concealment. It is they who build an entire system of compensation around appearance. Why is that? The answer may be very unpleasant. Because the upper echelon of society didn't just live better, they lived differently. They had more cosmetics, more ointments, more medical procedures, more heavy compounds, more enclosed rooms, more experiments on the body for the sake of status and propriety. What was considered luxury could turn out to be a slow-acting poison. It wasn't poverty that weakened the elite, but the aristocratic environment itself.
Imagine a person who constantly covers their skin with aggressive white lead, wears heavy powder, breathes in its finest particles, uses dubious remedies, spends their life in halls filled with candle smoke, fragrances, and dust, and is also under the continuous psychological pressure of a court where one cannot look tired, ill, or natural. Such a life, from the outside, looks like the pinnacle of civilization. But inside, it may turn out to be a laboratory of slow decay. This is precisely why privilege could turn into a trap. The higher the status, the greater the demands on appearance. The greater the demands on appearance, the more interventions into the body. The more interventions, the stronger the dependence on artificial means. And when dependence becomes mass, it is no longer perceived as an alarming symptom. It turns into the norm of the highest circle. This is a very important turn, because it explains why the weakness of the elite didn't look like weakness. It was quickly packaged into the language of refinement. Artificiality became good manners. The loss of naturalness, a sign of civilization. Everything that could once have been considered a defect was gradually renamed as style. And here begins the next stage of this story. Not just to hide a flaw, but to make everyone consider it a virtue. The most effective power acts not when it prohibits something, but when it changes the meaning of a phenomenon. This, it seems, is exactly what happened with the aristocracy's appearance. Everything that could look like a sign of bodily weakness is step by step repackaged into a sign of progress. A natural appearance becomes crude, an artificial one cultured. The old type of appearance is declared backward. The new one, the norm of a civilized person. Look at how often in history the elite reinforces its distinction through the body. Manners, gestures, clothing, gait, speech, beard, hair. These are not trifles. They are the boundary between us and the rest. And if for some reason the top begins to lose the natural signs of strength and maturity, it has only one path: to declare the new deficiency the new ideal. Then a man without a beard no longer seems weakened. He seems modern. A person with an artificial head no longer seems strange. He seems well-bred and belonging to a high culture. This is where the true cunning of the system lies. The problem is not hidden entirely.
it is put on display, but in a renamed form. What yesterday would have been cause for alarm becomes today a sign of refinement, and everyone is obliged to accept this change of language, because otherwise they fall out of the circle. Power over meaning here turns out to be stronger than power over the body. Such a mechanism always works the same way. First, a norm is created. Then prestige is built around it. Then any deviation from this norm begins to be perceived as a lower level of culture. And now an artificial head, a smooth face, a covered neck, a white mask, and a set of obligatory external rituals form a new standard. Not because it is convenient, but because it is beneficial to those who shape the rules. But if the new norm is so important, it cannot be sustained by taste alone. It must be supported by an entire economy. Craftsmen, raw materials, service rituals, hair supplies, endless image renewal. And then the wig finally ceases to be an ornament. It becomes part of a large machine of concealment, operating at the level of an entire society. As soon as we look at wigs, not as a fashionable accessory, but as a mass necessity, the scale of the phenomenon immediately becomes visible. This is no longer a private choice of a rich person. This is an industry, a huge, voracious, costly system involving craftsmen, suppliers, barbers, powder merchants, frame makers, service personnel, supplies of human and animal hair, constant repair and renewal of this entire enterprise. And here a particularly harsh question arises. What is society willing to spend such resources on? For a game of beauty? Perhaps, partly. But when expenses become systemic and the detail of appearance itself becomes almost obligatory, it begins to look more like a social function. The wig works as an element of collective camouflage. It conceals a problem not for one person, but for an entire caste. Therefore, no expense can be spared on it. The facade rests upon it. There is another sharp edge to this. Where did the hair come from? Who became the raw material for this aesthetic machine? The class divide is especially noticeable here. Some wear the construction as a symbol of greatness. Others supply the material for it. Some conceal weakness. Others involuntarily help conceal it. And this very logic already looks almost like a biological hierarchy, where the top loses its natural appearance and the bottom becomes a resource for preserving someone else's image. Thus, society begins to resemble a theater where the scenery is maintained by the entire country. The aristocracy is obliged to look as if everything is fine with them. Therefore, the wig is no longer about taste. It is about the obligation to preserve the legend, about the right to power, which cannot be supported by natural bodily persuasiveness, and therefore must be supported by costume, ritual, complex symbolism, and an expensive artificial shell. But the more we scrutinize this system, the less it is limited to appearance alone. Because what becomes strange is not only a person's face, but the very environment in which they live. Palaces, halls, windows, scales. All of this suddenly also begins to raise unpleasant questions. At this point, the story takes an unexpected turn. Because what begins to seem strange is not only the aristocrat's body, but also the space around him. Look at the old palaces, manor houses, ceremonial halls, and administrative buildings of the 18th and 19th centuries. Huge windows, high ceilings, colossal room volumes. Proportions that don't always look friendly to humans, especially if you believe the stories about the harsh climate, weak heating, and the constant struggle for comfort. And here, a feeling of disconnect arises. We are painted a picture of the elite as people obsessed with status, convenience, and external order. Yet, their world often looks as if it was created according to rules that don't quite align with their everyday needs. Spaces that are too large, geometry that is too strange, too many buildings that seem designed for a different scale of life. And it is precisely in this environment that people live who simultaneously swathe themselves in fabrics, powder themselves, hide their necks, cover their arms, and build an entire system of protective layers around the body. From this, an alternative thought is born, one that official history doesn't even like to entertain as a question. What if a significant part of this elite did not so much create the world around them, but inherited it in a damaged state? They didn't build it, they occupied it. They didn't invent it, they adapted to it. Then the wig, the facial mask, and the entire language of the court begin to look like elements of adaptation to a foreign environment, to a world that came to them already after some kind of rupture. This doesn't mean everything should immediately be attributed to one grand secret, but logic catches on to logic. If the space around a person looks alien, and the person's own body appears artificially maintained, a connection begins to form between these levels. We see not an era of confident flourishing, but an era of adaptation. An era that loudly speaks of brilliance, but itself constantly relies on props, bodily, aesthetic, architectural. And at this moment, the story about hair finally ceases to be a minor oddity. It becomes part of something larger. As if behind the ceremonial culture lies an entire world, after a blow, after a fracture, after an event that isn't spoken about directly. And then the hairless elite no longer looks like a quirk, but a symptom of an era of survivors. Now let's put it all together. Mass wigs, the white facial mask, a strange insistence on hiding living skin and natural hair, clothing that covers vulnerable areas, gestures, smells, prosthetics, discipline of appearance, architecture that in places seems too large, too alien, too disconnected from the image of a fragile, refined elite. Individually, all of this can still be explained by habit, taste, or ritual. But together, it begins to form a different picture. In this picture, the aristocracy of the 18th to 19th centuries no longer looks like the shining pinnacle of a human type. It looks like a layer that is desperately maintaining a facade of strength against a backdrop of internal fracture. And the wig in such a system is one of the most important symbols. Not because it's beautiful, but because it allows the face of power to be preserved, even when power itself has lost its natural persuasiveness. This is where a strong alternative hypothesis is born. Perhaps the society of that era was experiencing the consequences of a broader environmental crisis, not necessarily one that can be proven by a school textbook, but one that was reflected in bodies, in daily life, and in norms. And the top of society, instead of acknowledging weakness, did what elites always do. It turned its vulnerability into a new ceremony, translated the problem into the language of beauty, progress, and propriety, made everyone look not at the sickness, but at the brilliance of the form. That is why the wig is so important for understanding the era. It is not a minor costume detail. It is a material sign that the ruling class needed visual compensation. It had to look strong, full of life, and legitimately standing above the rest. Even if behind this picture hid fatigue, decay, dependence on artificial means, and the fear of being seen without a layer of protective symbolism. And the clearer this becomes, the closer we come to the final question: why are we so persistently offered the simplest version? Why is this whole complex, troubling, and at times too inconvenient chain again and again reduced to one phrase? It was the fashion. Because a simple explanation is always more advantageous than a complex truth. Saying wigs were fashionable is convenient. Saying it's a question of hygiene is even more convenient. Such formulas are soothing. They don't require re-examining the era. They don't require looking at portraits anew. They don't require asking questions about the health of the elite, about the fear of external decay, about what was hidden behind the facade of enlightenment and courtly elegance. And yet, it is precisely these questions that make the past come alive. Perhaps we will never get a definitive answer in a form that satisfies everyone. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is to see how fragile the official picture is if you start carefully comparing the details. Why does an entire era hide its hair? Why is the face covered with a mask of white powder? Why is the body constantly wrapped, covered, regulated? Why is an artificial appearance so persistently declared the pinnacle of civilization? And why, behind all this, does one sense not confidence, but tension? At this moment, the wig ceases to be a funny museum detail. It turns into a trace of great anxiety, into a symbol of an era that perhaps feared not dirt, but exposure. Not untidiness, but the truth about its own condition. And then the portraits of the 18th and 19th centuries begin to look different. No longer as a gallery of beautiful people from the past, but as an archive of carefully assembled masks. Masks behind which weakness, fear, and the necessity of maintaining the legend at any cost were hidden. That is why this story is so gripping. It's not about a hairstyle. It's about power and the body. About how an entire ruling class can turn artificiality into the norm, just to avoid acknowledging an internal crisis. About how brilliance sometimes turns out to be just a thin film over decay. And if, after this video, the next time you look at an old portrait and suddenly sense in it not luxury, but anxiety, then we have not been moving in vain. Write in the comments which version you find most convincing. Like if you need analyses like this. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to hit the bell so you don't miss the next stories. Because the further we go into the past, the more often it turns out that the strangest details were right in front of our eyes.